Chapter 11. The sea mist and the rain continued without intermission next morning, but shopping with umbrellas and mackintoshes was unusually brisk, for there was, naturally, a universally felt desire to catch sight of a Contessa with as little delay as possible. The foggy conditions perhaps added to the excitement, for it was not possible to see more than a few yards, and thus, at any moment, anybody might almost run into her. Diver's impressions, meagre though they were, had been thoroughly circulated, but the morning passed, and the ladies of Tilling went home to change their wet things and take a little ammoniated quinine as a precaution after so long and chilly an exposure, without a single one of them having caught sight of the single eyeglass. It was disappointing, but the disappointment was bearable, since Mr. Wise, so far from wanting his party to be very small, had been encouraged by Mrs. Poppet to hope that it would include all his world of Tilling, with one exception. He had hopes with regard to the Major, and the Captain, and the Padre and wee wifey, and Irene and Miss Mapp, and of course Isabel. But apparently he despaired of Diva. She alone, therefore, was absent from this long, wet shopping, for she waited indoors, almost pen in hand, to answer in the affirmative the invitation which had, at present, not arrived. Owing to the thickness of the fog, her absence from the street passed unnoticed, for everybody supposed that everybody else had seen her, while she, biting her nails at home, waited and waited and waited. Then she waited. About 1:15 she gave it up, and duly telephoned, according to promise, via Janet and Withers, to Miss Mapp, to say that Mr. Wise had not yet hoped. It was very unpleasant to let them know, but if she had herself rung up and been answered by Elizabeth, who usually rushed to the telephone, she felt that she would sooner have choked than have delivered this message. So Janet telephoned, and Withers said she would tell her mistress, and did. Miss Mapp was steeped in pleasant conjectures. The most likely of all was that the Contessa had seen that roundabout little busybody in the station and taken an instant dislike to her through her single eyeglass. Or she might have seen poor Diva inquisitively inspecting the luggage with the coronets and the F's on it, and have learned with pain that this was one of the ladies of Tilling. "Algernon," she would have said, so said Miss Mapp to herself, "who is that queer little woman? Is she going to steal some of my luggage?" And then Algernon would have told her that this was poor Diva, quite a decent sort of little body. But when it came to Algernon asking his guests for the dinner party in honour of his betrothal and her arrival at Tilling, no doubt the Contessa would have said, "Algernon, I beg." Or if Diva, poor Diva, was right in her conjectures that the notes had been written before the arrival of the train, it was evident that Algernon had torn up the one addressed to Diva when the Contessa heard whom she was to meet the next evening. Or Susan might easily have insinuated that they would have 2 very pleasant tables of bridge after dinner without including Diva, who was so wrong and quarrelsome over the score. Any of these explanations were quite satisfactory, and since Diva would not be present, Miss Mapp would naturally don the crimson lake. They would all see what crimson lake looked like when it decked a suitable wearer, and was not parodied on the other side of a card table. How true, as dear Major Benjy had said, that one woman could wear what another could not. And if there was a woman who could not wear crimson lake, it was Diva. Or was Mr. Wise really ashamed to let his sister see Diva in the crimson lake? It would be just like him to be considerate of Diva and not permit her to make a guy of herself before the Italian aristocracy. No doubt he would ask her to lunch some day, quite quietly. Or had... Miss Mapp bloomed with pretty conjectures, like some alpine meadow when smitten into flower by the spring, and enjoyed her lunch very much indeed. The anxiety and suspense of the morning, which, instead of being relieved, had ended in utter gloom, gave Diva a headache, and she adopted her usual strenuous methods of getting rid of it. So, instead of lying down and taking aspirin and dozing, she set out after lunch to walk it off. She sprinted and splashed along the miry roads, indifferent as to whether she stepped in puddles or not, and careless how wet she got. She bit on the bullet of her omission from the dinner party this evening, determining not to mind one atom about it, but to look forward to a pleasant evening at home instead of going out, like this, in the wet. And never, never, under any circumstances, would she ask any of the guests what sort of an evening had been spent, how Mr. Wise announced the news, and how the Faradiddleone played bridge. She said that satirical word aloud, mouthing it to the puddles and the dripping hedgerows. She would not evince the slightest interest in it all. She would cover it with spadefuls of oblivion, and when next she met Mr. Wise she would, whatever she might feel, behave exactly as usual. She plumed herself on this dignified resolution, and walked so fast that the hedgerows became quite transparent. That was the proper thing to do. She had been grossly slighted, and, like a true lady, would be unaware of that slight, whereas poor Elizabeth, under such circumstances, would have devised 100 petty schemes for rendering Mr. Wise's life a burden to him. But if, she only said if, she found any reason to believe that Susan was at the bottom of this, then probably she would think of something worthy not so much of a true lady, but of a true woman. Without asking any questions, she might easily arrive at information which would enable her to identify Susan as the culprit, and she would then act in some way which would astonish Susan. What that way was, she need not think yet, and so she devoted her entire mind to the question all the way home. Feeling better, and with her headache quite gone, she arrived in Tilling again, drenched to the skin. It was already after tea-time, and she abandoned tea altogether, and prepared to console herself for her exclusion from gaiety with a good blow-out, in the shape of regular dinner, instead of the usual muffin now and a tray later. To add dignity to her feast, she put on the Crimson Lake tea-gown for the last time that it would be Crimson Lake, though the same tea-gown still, since tomorrow it would be sent to the dyers to go into perpetual mourning for its vanished glories. She had meant to send it today, but all this misery and anxiety had put it out of her head. Having dressed thus, to the great astonishment of Janet, she sat down to divert her mind from trouble by Patience. As if to reward her for her stubborn fortitude, the malignity of the cards relented, and she brought out an intricate matter 3 times running. The clock on her mantelpiece chiming 7:45 surprised her with the lateness of the hour, and recalled to her with a stab of pain that it was dinner-time at Mr. Wise's, and at this moment some 7 pairs of eager feet were approaching the door. Well, she was dining at 7:45 too. Janet would enter presently to tell her that her own banquet was ready, and gathering up her cards, she spent a pleasant though regretful minute in looking at herself and the Crimson Lake for the last time in her long glass. The tremendous walk in the rain had given her an almost equally high colour. Janet's foot was heard on the stairs, and she turned away from the glass. Janet entered. "Dinner?" said Diva. "No, ma'am, the telephone," said Janet. "Mr. Wise is on the telephone and wants to speak to you very particularly." "Mr. Wise himself?" asked Diva, hardly believing her ears, for she knew Mr. Wise's opinion of the telephone. "Yes, ma'am." Diva walked slowly, but reflected rapidly. What must have happened was that somebody had been taken ill at the last moment. Was it Elizabeth? And that now he wanted her to fill the gap. She was torn in two. Passionately as she longed to dine at Mr. Wise's, she did not see how such a course was compatible with dignity. He had only asked her to suit his own convenience. It was not out of encouragement to hope that he invited her now. No, Mr. Wise should want. She would say that she had friends dining with her. That was what the true lady would do. She took up the earpiece and said, "Hello?" It was certainly Mr. Wise's voice that spoke to her, and it seemed to tremble with anxiety. "Dear lady," he began, "a most terrible thing has happened." Wonder if Elizabeth's very ill, thought Diva. "Quite terrible," said Mr. Wise. "Can you hear?" "Yes," said Diva, hardening her heart. "By the most calamitous mistake, the note which I wrote you yesterday was never delivered. Figgis has just found it in the pocket of his overcoat. I shall certainly dismiss him unless you plead for him. Can you hear?" "Yes," said Diva excitedly. In it, I told you that I had been encouraged to hope that you would dine with me tonight. There was such a gratifying response to my other invitations that I most culpably and carelessly, dear lady, thought that everybody had accepted. Can you hear?" "Of course I can," shouted Diver. "Well, I come on my knees to you. Can you possibly forgive the joint stupidity of Figures and me, and honour me after all? We will put dinner off, of course. At what time, in case you are ever so kind and indulgent as to come, shall we have it? Do not break my heart by refusing. Mrs. Poppet will send her car for you." "I've already dressed for dinner," said Diver proudly. "Very pleased to come at once." "You are too kind. You are angelic," said Mr. Wise. "The car shall start at once. It is at my door now." "Right," said Diver. "Too good, too kind," murmured Mr. Wise. "Figures, what do I do next?" Diver clapped the instrument into place. "Powder," she said to herself, remembering what she had seen in the glass, and whizzed upstairs. Her fish would have to be degraded into kedgeree, though plaice would have done just as well as sole for that. The cutlets could be heated up again, and perhaps the whisking for the apple meringue had not begun yet, and could still be stopped. "Janet," she shouted, "going out to dinner. Stop the meringue." She dashed an interesting pallor onto her face as she heard the hooting of the Royce, and coming downstairs, stepped into its warm luxuriousness, for the electric lamp was burning. There were Susan's sables there. It was thoughtful of Susan to put them in, but ostentatious. And there was a carriage rug, which she was convinced was new, and was very likely a present from Mr. Wise. And soon there was the light streaming out from Mr. Wise's open door, and Mr. Wise himself in the hall to meet and greet and thank and bless her. She pleaded for the contrite Figgis, and was conducted in a blaze of triumph into the drawing-room, where all Tilling was awaiting her. She was led up to the Contessa, with whom Miss Mapp, wreathed in sycophantic smiles, was eagerly conversing. The Crimson Lakes. There were embarrassing moments during dinner. The Contessa, confused by having so many people introduced to her in a lump, got all their names wrong, and addressed her neighbours as Captain Flint and Major Puffin, and thought that Diver was Miss Mapp. She seemed vivacious and good-humoured, dropped her eyeglass into her soup, talked with her mouth full, and drank a good deal of wine, which was a very bad example for Major Puffin. Then there were many sudden and complete pauses in the talk, for Diver's news of the kissing of Mrs. Poppet by the Contessa had spread like wildfire through the fog this morning, owing to Miss Mapp's dissemination of it, and now, whenever Mr. Wise raised his voice ever so little, everybody else stopped talking, in the expectation that the news was about to be announced. Occasionally, also, the Contessa addressed some remark to her brother in shrill and voluble Italian, which rather confirmed the gloomy estimate of her table manners in the matter of talking with her mouth full, for to speak in Italian was equivalent to whispering, since the purport of what she said could not be understood by anybody except him. Then also the sensation of dining with a countess produced a slight feeling of strain, which, in addition to the correct behaviour which Mr. Wise's presence always induced, almost congealed correctness into stiffness. But as dinner went on, her evident enjoyment of herself made itself felt, and her eccentricities, though carefully observed and noted by Miss Mapp, were not succeeded by silences and hurried bursts of conversation. "And is your ladyship making a long stay in Tilling?" asked the real Major, to cover the pause which had been caused by Mr. Wise saying something across the table to Isabel. She dropped her eyeglass with quite a splash into her gravy, pulled it out again by the string as if landing a fish, and sucked it. "That depends on you, gentlemen," she said with greater audacity than was usual in Tilling. "If you and Major Puffin and that sweet little Scotch clergyman all fall in love with me, and fight duels about me, I will stop forever." The Major recovered himself before anybody else. "Your ladyship may take that for granted," he said, gallantly, and a perfect hubbub of conversation rose to cover this awful topic. She laid her hand on his arm. "You must not call me ladyship, Captain Flint," she said. "Only servants say that. Contessa, if you like. And you must blow away this fog for me. I have seen nothing but bales of cotton wool out of the window. Tell me this, too. Why are those ladies dressed alike? Are they sisters? Mrs. Mapp, the little round one, and her sister, the big round one. The Major cast an apprehensive eye on Miss Mapp, seated just opposite, whose acuteness of hearing was one of the terrors of Tilling. His apprehensions were perfectly well-founded, and Miss Mapp hated and despised the Contessa from that hour. "Oh, no, not sisters," said he, "and you've made a little error about the names. The one opposite is Miss Mapp, the other is Mrs. Plasto." The Contessa moderated her voice. "I see. She looks vexed, your Miss Mapp. I think she must have heard, and I will be very nice to her afterwards. Why does not one of you gentlemen marry her? I see I shall have to arrange that. The sweet little Scotch clergyman, now. Little men like big wives. Ah, married already, is he, to the mouse? Then it must be you, Captain Flint. We must have more marriages in Tilling." Miss Mapp could not help glancing at the Contessa as she made this remarkable observation. It must be the cue, she thought, for the announcement of that which she had known so long. In the space of a wink, the clever Contessa saw that she had her attention, and spoke rather loudly to the Major. "I have lost my heart to your Miss Mapp," she said. "I am jealous of you, Captain Flint. She will be my great friend in Tilling, and if you marry her I shall hate you, for that will mean that she likes you best." Miss Mapp hated nobody at that moment, not even Diver, off whose face the hastily applied powder was crumbling, leaving little red marks peeping out like the stars on a fine evening. Dinner came to an end with roasted chestnuts brought by the Contessa from Capri. "I will always scold Amelia for the luggage she takes with her," said Mr. Wise to Diver. "Amelia, dear, you are my hostess tonight." Everybody saw him look at Mrs. Poppit. "You must catch somebody's eye." "I will catch Miss Mapp's," said Amelia, and all the ladies rose as if connected with some hidden mechanism which moved them simultaneously. There was a great deal of pretty diffidence at the door, but the Contessa put an end to that. "Eldest first," she said, and marched out, making Miss Mapp, Diver, and the mouse feel remarkably young. She might drop her eyeglass and talk with her mouth full, but really such tact! They all determined to adopt this pleasing device in the future. The disappointment about the announcement of the engagement was sensibly assuaged, and Miss Mapp and Susan, in their eagerness to be younger than the Contessa, and yet take precedence of all the rest, almost stuck in the doorway. They rebounded from each other, and Diver whizzed out between them. Quaint Irene went in her right place, last. However quaint Irene was, there was no use in pretending that she was not the youngest. However hopelessly Amelia had lost her heart to Miss Mapp, she did not devote her undivided attention to her in the drawing-room, but swiftly established herself at the card-table, where she proceeded, with a most complicated sort of patience and a series of cigarettes, to while away the time till the gentlemen joined them. Though the ladies of Tilling had plenty to say to each other, it was all about her, and such comments could not conveniently be made in her presence. Unless, like her, they talked some language unknown to the subject of their conversation, they could not talk at all, and so they gathered round her table and watched the lightning rapidity with which she piled black knaves on red queens in some packs, and red knaves on black queens in others. She had taken off all her rings in order to procure a greater freedom of finger, and her eyeglass continued to crash onto a glittering mass of magnificent gems. The rapidity of her motions was only equalled by the swift and surprising monologue that poured from her mouth. "There, that odious king gets in my way," she said. "So like a man to poke himself in where he isn't wanted. Bacco. No, not that. I have a cigarette. I hear all you ladies are terrific bridge players. We will have a game presently, and I shall sink into the earth with terror at your Camorra. Dio, there's another king, and that's his own queen, whom he doesn't want at all. He is amoroso for that black queen, who is quite covered up, and he would like to be covered up with her. Susan, my dear." That was interesting, but they all knew it already. "Kindly ring the bell for coffee. I expire if I do not get my coffee at once, and a toothpick. Tell me all the scandal of Tilling, Miss Mapp, while I play, all the dreadful histories of that Major and that Captain. Such a grand air has the Captain. No, it is the Major, the one who does not limp. Which of all you ladies do they love most? It is Miss Mapp, I believe. That is why she does not answer me. Ah, here is the coffee. And the other king. 3 lumps of sugar, dear Susan, and then stir it up well and hold it to my mouth so that I can drink without interruption. Ah, the ace. He is the intervener, or is it the king's proctor? It would be nice to have a proctor who told you all the love affairs that were going on. Susan, you must get me a proctor. You shall be my proctor. And here are the men, the wretches. They have been preferring wine to women, and we shall have our bridge. And if anybody scolds me, I shall cry, Miss Mapp, and Captain Flint will hold my hand and comfort me. She gathered up a heap of cards and rings, dropped them on the floor, and cut with the remainder. Miss Mapp was very lenient with the Contessa, who was her partner, and pointed out the mistakes of her and their adversaries with the most winning smile and eagerness to explain things properly. Then she revoked heavily herself, and the Contessa, so far from being angry with her, burst into peals of unquenchable merriment. This way of taking a revoke was new to Tilling, for the right thing was for the revoker's partner to sulk and be sarcastic for at least 20 minutes after. The Contessa's laughter continued to spurt out at intervals during the rest of the rubber, and it was all very pleasant, but at the end she said she was not up to Tilling's standards at all, and refused to play any more. Miss Mapp, in the highest good humour, urged her not to despair. "Indeed, dear Contessa," she said, "you play very well. A little overbidding of your hand, perhaps, do you think? But that is a tendency we are all subject to. I often overbid my hand myself. Not a little wee rubber more? I'm sure I should like to be your partner again. You must come and play at my house some afternoon. We will have tea early and get a good 2 hours. Nothing like practice." The evening came to an end without the great announcement being made, but Miss Mapp, as she reviewed the events of the party, sitting next morning in her observation window, found the whole evidence so overwhelming that it was no longer worth while to form conjectures, however fruitful, on the subject, and she diverted her mind to pleasing reminiscences and projects for the future. She had certainly been distinguished by the Contessa's marked regard, and her opinion of her charm and ability was of the very highest. No doubt her strange remark about duelling at dinner had been humorous in intention, but many a true word is spoken in jest, and the Contessa, perspicacious woman, had seen at once that Major Benjy and Captain Puffin were just the sort of men who might get to duelling, or at any rate challenging, about a woman. And her asking which of the ladies the men were most in love with, and her saying that she believed it was Miss Mapp. Miss Mapp had turned nearly as red as poor Diver when that came out, so lightly, and yet so acutely. Diver. It had, of course, been a horrid blow to find that Diver had been asked to Mr. Wise's party in the first instance, and an even shrewder one when Diver entered, with such unnecessary fussing and apology on the part of Mr. Wise, in the Crimson Lake. Luckily it would be seen no more, for Diver had promised, if you could trust Diver, to send it to the Dyers. But it was a great puzzle to know why Diver had it on at all, if she was preparing to spend a solitary evening at home. By 8 o'clock she ought by rights to have already had her tray, dressed in some old thing. But within 3 minutes of her being telephoned for, she had appeared in the Crimson Lake, and eaten so heartily that it was impossible to imagine, greedy though she was, that she had already consumed her tray. But, in spite of Diver's adventitious triumph, the main feeling in Miss Mapp's mind was pity for her. She looked so ridiculous in that dress, with the powder peeling off her red face. No wonder the dear Contessa stared when she came in. There was her bridge party for the Contessa to consider. The Contessa would be less nervous, perhaps, if there was only one table. That would be more homey and cosy, and it would at the same time give rise to great heart-burnings and indignation in the breasts of those who were left out. Diver would certainly be one of the spurned, and the Contessa would not play with Mr. Wise. Then there was Major Benjy. He must certainly be asked, for it was evidence that the Contessa delighted in him. Suddenly Miss Mapp began to feel less sure that Major Benjy must be of the party. The Contessa, charming though she was, had said several very tropical, Italian things to him. She had told him that she would stop here forever if the men fought duels about her. She had said, "You dear darling," to him at bridge when, as adversary, he failed to trump her losing card, and she had asked him to ask her to tea, with no one else, for I have a great deal to say to you, when the general Macédoine of sables, au reservoirs, and thanks for such a nice evening took place in the hall. Miss Mapp was not, in fact, sure, when she thought it over, that the Contessa was a nice friend for Major Benjy. She did not do him the injustice of imagining that he would ask her to tea alone. The very suggestion proved that it must be a piece of the Contessa's southern extravagance of expression. But, after all, thought Miss Mapp to herself, as she writhed at the idea, her other extravagant expressions were proved to cover a good deal of truth. In fact, the Major's chance of being asked to the select bridge party diminished swiftly towards vanishing point. It was time, and indeed late, to set forth on morning marketings, and Miss Mapp had already determined not to carry her capacious basket with her today, in case of meeting the Contessa in the High Street. It would be grander and wiser and more magnificent to go basketless and direct that the goods should be sent up, rather than run the risk of encountering the Contessa with a basket containing a couple of mutton cutlets, a ball of wool, and some tooth powder. So she put on her Prince of Wales's cloak, and, postponing further reflection over the bridge party till a less busy occasion, set forth in unencumbered gentility for the morning gossip. At the corner of the High Street she ran into Diver. "News," said Diver. "Met Mr. Wise just now. Engaged to Susan. All over the town by now. Everybody knows. Oh, there's the Padre for the first time." She shot across the street, and Miss Mapp, shaking the dust of Diver off her feet, proceeded on her chagrined way. Annoyed as she was with Diver, she was almost more annoyed with Susan. After all she had done for Susan, Susan ought to have told her long ago, pledging her to secrecy. But to be told like this, by that common Diver, without any secrecy at all, was an affront that she would find it hard to forgive Susan for. She mentally reduced by a half the sum that she had determined to squander on Susan's wedding present. It should be plated, not silver, and if Susan was not careful, it shouldn't be plated at all. She had just come out of the chemist's after an indignant interview about precipitated chalk. He had deposited the small packet on the counter when she asked to have it sent up to her house. He could not undertake to deliver small packages. She left the precipitated chalk lying there. Emerging, she heard a loud, foreign sort of scream from close at hand. There was the Contessa, all by herself, carrying a marketing basket of unusual size and newness. It contained a bloody steak and a crab. "But where is your basket, Miss Mapp?" she exclaimed. "Algernon told me that all the great ladies of Tilling went marketing in the morning with big baskets, and that if I aspired to be du monde, I must have my basket too. It is the greatest fun, and I have already written to Checo to say I am just going marketing with my basket. Look, the steak is for Figgis, and the crab is for Algernon and me, if Figgis does not get it. But why are you not du monde? Are you du demi-monde, Miss Mapp?" She gave a croak of laughter and tickled the crab. "Will he eat the steak, do you think?" she went on. "Is he not lively? I went to the shop of Mr. Hopkins, who was not there because he was engaged with Miss Coles. And was that not Miss Coles last night at my brother's, the one who spat in the fire when nobody but I was looking? You are enchanting at Tilling. What is Mr. Hopkins doing with Miss Coles? Do they kiss? But your market basket, that disappoints me, for Algernon said you had the biggest market basket of all. I bought the biggest I could find. Is it as big as yours?" Miss Mapp's head was in a whirl. The Contessa said in the loudest possible voice all that everybody else only whispered. She displayed, in her basket, all that everybody else covered up with thick layers of paper. If Miss Mapp had only guessed that the Contessa would have a market basket, she would have paraded the High Street with a leg of mutton protruding from one end and a pair of Wellington boots from the other. But who could have suspected that a Contessa? Black thoughts succeeded. Was it possible that Mr. Wise had been satirical about the affairs of Tilling? If so, she wished him nothing worse than to be married to Susan. But a playful face must be put, for the moment, on the situation. "Too lovely of you, dear Contessa," she said. "May we go marketing together tomorrow, and we will measure the size of our baskets. Such fun I have, too, laughing at the dear people in Tilling. But what thrilling news this morning about our sweet Susan and your dear brother, though of course I knew it long ago." "Indeed? How is that?" said the Contessa quite sharply. Miss Mapp was nettled at her tone. "Oh, you must allow me 2 eyes," she said, since it was merely tedious to explain how she had seen them from behind a curtain, kissing in the garden. "Just 2 eyes." "And a nose for scent," remarked the Contessa very genially. This was certainly coarse, though probably Italian. Miss Mapp's opinion of the Contessa fluctuated violently, like a barometer before a storm, and indicated changeable. "Dear Susan is such an intimate friend," she said. The Contessa looked at her very fixedly for a moment, and then appeared to dismiss the matter. "My crab, my steak," she said. "And where does your nice Captain, no, Major Flint, live? I have a note to leave on him, for he has asked me to tea all alone to see his tiger skins. He is going to be my flirt while I am in Tilling, and when I go he will break his heart, but I will have told him who can mend it again." "Dear Major Benjy," said Miss Mapp, at her wit's end to know how to deal with so feather-tongued a lady. "What a treat it will be to him to have you to tea. Today, is it?" The Contessa quite distinctly winked behind her eyeglass, which she had put up to look at Diver, who whirled by on the other side of the street. "And if I said today," she remarked, "you would— what is it that one says?" And she indicated Diver. "Yes, you would pop in, and the good Major would pay no attention to me. So, if I tell you I shall go today, you will know that is a lie, you clever Miss Mapp. And so you will go to tea with him tomorrow and find me there. Bene. Now, where is his house?" This was a sort of scheming that had never entered into Miss Mapp's life, and she saw with pain how shallow she had been all these years. Often and often she had, when inquisitive questions were put her, answered them without any strict subservience to truth, but never had she thought of confusing the issues like this. If she told Diver a lie, Diver probably guessed it was a lie and acted accordingly, but she had never thought of making it practically impossible to tell whether it was a lie or not. She had no more idea, when she walked back along the high street with the Contessa swinging her basket by her side, whether that lady was going to tea with Major Benjy today or tomorrow or when, than she knew whether the crab was going to eat the beefsteak. "There's his house," she said, as they paused at the dentist's corner, "and there's mine next to it, with the little bow window of my garden room looking out onto the street. I hope to welcome you there, dear Contessa, for a tiny game of bridge and some tea one of these days very soon. What day do you think? Tomorrow?" Then she would know if the Contessa was going to tea with Major Benjy tomorrow. Unfortunately, the Contessa appeared to know that she would know it too. "My flirt," she said. "Perhaps I will be having tea with my flirt tomorrow." Better anything than that. "I will ask him, too, to meet you," said Miss Mapp, feeling in some awful and helpless way that she was playing her adversary's game. Adversary? Did she say to herself? She did. The inscrutable Contessa was up to that, too. "I will not amalgamate my treats," she said. "So that is his house. What a charming house! How my heart flutters as I ring the bell." Miss Mapp was now quite distraught. There was the possibility that the Contessa might tell Major Benjy that it was time he married, but on the other hand she was making arrangements to go to tea with him on an unknown date, and the hero of amorous adventures in India and elsewhere might lose his heart again to somebody quite different from one whom he could hope to marry. By daylight the dear Contessa was undeniably plain. That was something. But in these short days tea would be conducted by artificial light, and by artificial light she was not so like a rabbit. What was worse was that by any light she had a liveliness which might be mistaken for wit, and a flattering manner which might be taken for sincerity. She hoped men were not so easily duped as that, and was sadly afraid that they were. Blind fools. The number of visits that Miss Mapp made about tea-time in this week before Christmas to the post-box at the corner of the High Street, with an envelope in her hand containing Mr. Hopkins' bill for fish and a postal order enclosed, baffles computation. Naturally, she did not intend, either by day or night, to risk being found again with a blank, unstamped envelope in her hand, and the one enclosing Mr. Hopkins's bill and the postal order would have passed scrutiny for correctness anywhere. But fair and calm as was the exterior of that envelope, none could tell how agitated was the hand that carried it backwards and forwards until the edges got crumpled and the instruction clouded with much fingering. Indeed, of all the tricks that Miss Mapp had compassed for others, none was so sumptuously contrived as that in which she had now entangled herself. For these December days were dark, and in consequence, not only would the Contessa be looking her best, such as it was, at tea-time, but from Miss Mapp's window it was impossible to tell whether she had gone to tea with him on any particular afternoon, for there had been a strike at the gas-works, and the lamp at the corner, which in happier days would have told all, told nothing whatever. Miss Mapp must therefore trudge to the letter-box with Mr. Hopkins's bill in her hand as she went out, and, after a feint of posting it, with it in her pocket as she came back, in order to gather, from the light in the windows, from the sound of conversation that would be audible as she passed close beneath them, whether the Major was having tea there or not, and with whom. Should she hear that ringing laugh which had sounded so pleasant when she revoked, but now was so sinister, she had quite determined to go in and borrow a book, or a tiger skin, anything. The Major could scarcely fail to ask her to tea, and once there, wild horses should not drag her away until she had outstayed the other visitor. Then, as her malady of jealousy grew more feverish, she began to perceive, as by the ray of some dreadful dawn, that lights in the Major's room and sounds of elfin laughter were not completely trustworthy as proofs that the Contessa was there. It was possible, awfully possible, that the two might be sitting in the firelight, that voices might be hushed to amorous whisperings, that pregnant smiles might be taking the place of laughter. On one such afternoon, as she came back from the letter-box with patient Mr. Hopkins' overdue bill in her pocket, a wild certainty seized her, when she saw how closely the curtains were drawn, and how still it seemed inside his room, that firelight dalliance was going on. She rang the bell, and imagined she heard whisperings inside while it was being answered. Presently the light went up in the hall, and the Major's Mrs. Dominic answered the door. "The Major is in, I think, isn't he, Mrs. Dominic?" said Miss Mapp, in her most insinuating tones. "No, miss, out," said Dominic, uncompromisingly. Miss Mapp wondered if Dominic drank. "Dear me, how tiresome, when he told me," said she, with playful annoyance. "Would you be very kind, Mrs. Dominic, and just see for certain that he is not in his room? He may have come in." "No, miss, he's out," said Dominic, with the parrot-like utterance of the determined liar. "Any message?" Miss Mapp turned away, more certain than ever that he was in, and immersed in dalliance. She would have continued to be quite certain about it, had she not, glancing distractedly down the street, caught sight of him coming up with Captain Puffin. Meantime, she had twice attempted to get a cosy little party of 4, so as not to frighten the Contessa, to play bridge from tea till dinner, and on both occasions the Faradiddleony, for so she had become, was most unfortunately engaged. But the second of these disappointing replies contained the hope that they would meet at their marketings tomorrow morning, and though poor Miss Mapp was really getting very tired with these innumerable visits to the post-box, whether wet or fine, she set forth next morning with the hopes anyhow of finding out whether the Contessa had been to tea with Major Flint, or on what day she was going. There she was, just opposite the post-office, and there, oh shame, was Major Benjy on his way to the tram, in light-hearted conversation with her. It was a slight consolation that Captain Puffin was there too. Miss Mapp quickened her steps to a little tripping run. "Dear Contessa, so sorry I am late," she said. "Such a lot of little things to do this morning. Major Benjy, Captain Puffin. Oh, how naughty of you to have begun your shopping without me." "Only been to the grocer's," said the Contessa. "Major Benjy has been so amusing that I haven't got on with my shopping at all. I have written to Checo to say that there is no one so witty." Major Benjy, thought Miss Mapp bitterly, remembering how long it had taken her to arrive at that. And witty. She had not arrived at that yet. "No, indeed," said the Major. It was the Contessa, Miss Mapp, who has been so entertaining. I'm sure she would be, said Miss Mapp, with an enormous smile. And, oh, Major Benjy, you'll miss your tram unless you hurry, and get no golf at all, and then be vexed with us for keeping you. You men always blame us poor women. Well, upon my word, what's a game of golf compared with the pleasure of being with the ladies? Asked the Major, with a great fat bow. I want to catch that tram, said Puffin quite distinctly, and Miss Mapp found herself more nearly forgetting his inebriated insults than ever before. You poor Captain Puffin, said the Contessa. You shall catch it. Be off, both of you, at once. I will not say another word to either of you. I will never forgive you if you miss it. But tomorrow afternoon, Major Benjy? He turned round to bow again, and a bicycle, luckily for the rider going very slowly, butted softly into him from behind. Not hurt, called the Contessa. Good. Ah, Miss Mapp, let us get to our shopping. How well you manage those men. How right you are about them. They want their golf more than they want us, whatever they may say. They would hate us if we kept them from their golf. So sorry not to have been able to play bridge with you yesterday, but an engagement. What a busy place Tilling is. Let me see. Where is the list of things that Figgis told me to buy? That Figgis. A roller towel for his pantry, and some blacking for his boots, and some flannel, I suppose, for his fat stomach. It is all for Figgis. And there is that swift Mrs. Plastow. She comes like a train with a red light in her face and wheels and whistlings. She talks like a telegram. Good morning, Mrs. Plastow. Enjoyed my game of bridge, Contessa, panted Diver. Delightful game of bridge yesterday. The Contessa seemed in rather a hurry to reply, but long before she could get a word out, Miss Mapp felt she knew what had happened. So pleased, said the Contessa quickly. And now for Figgis's towels, Miss Mapp. 10 and 6pence apiece, he says. What a price to give for a towel. But I learn housekeeping like this, and Checo will delight in all the economies I shall make. Quick, to the draper's, lest there be no towels left. In spite of Figgis's list, the Contessa's shopping was soon over, and Miss Mapp, having seen her as far as the corner, walked on as if to her own house, in order to give her time to get to Mr. Wise's, and then fled back to the High Street. The suspense was unbearable. She had to know without delay when and where Diver and the Contessa had played bridge yesterday. Never had her eyes so rapidly scanned the movement of passengers in that entrancing thoroughfare in order to pick Diver out and learn from her precisely what had happened. There she was, coming out of the dyer's with her basket completely filled by a bulky package which it needed no ingenuity to identify as the late Crimson Lake. She would have to be pleasant with Diver, for as much as that perfidious woman might enjoy telling her where this furtive bridge party had taken place, she might enjoy even more torturing her with uncertainty. Diver could, if put to it, give no answer whatever to a direct question, but, skilfully changing the subject, talk about something utterly different. The Crimson Lake, said Miss Mapp, pointing to the basket. Hope it will turn out well, dear. There was a rather wicked light in Diver's eyes. Not Crimson Lake, she said. Jet black. Sweet of you to have it dyed again, dear Diver, said Miss Mapp. Not very expensive, I trust? Send the bill in to you if you like, said Diver. Miss Mapp laughed very pleasantly. That would be a good joke, she said. How nice it is that the dear Contessa takes so warmly to our Tilling ways. So amusing she was about the commissions Figgis had given her. But a wee bit satirical, do you think? This ought to put Diver in a good temper, for there was nothing she liked so much as a few little dabs at somebody else. Diver was not very good-natured. She is rather satirical, said Diver. Oh, tell me some of her amusing little speeches, said Miss Mapp enthusiastically. I can't always follow her, but you are so quick. A little coarse, too, at times, isn't she? What she said the other night when she was playing Patience about kings and queens wasn't quite, was it? And the toothpick. Yes, toothpick, said Diver. Perhaps she has bad teeth, said Miss Mapp. It runs in families, and Mr. Wise's, you know. We're lucky, you and I. Diver maintained a complete silence, and they had now come nearly as far as her door. If she would not give the information that she knew Miss Mapp longed for, she must be asked for it, with the uncertain hope that she would give it then. Been playing bridge lately, dear? Asked Miss Mapp. Quite lately, said Diver. I thought I heard you say something about it to the Contessa. Yesterday, was it? Whom did you play with? Diver paused, and when they had come quite to her door, made up her mind. Contessa, Susan, Mr. Wise, me, she said. But I thought she never played with Mr. Wise, said Miss Mapp. Had to get a 4, said Diver. Contessa wanted her bridge, nobody else. She popped into her house. There is no use in describing Miss Mapp's state of mind, except by saying that for the moment she quite forgot that the Contessa was almost certainly going to tea with Major Benjy tomorrow.